Good evening. How are you tonight? Good to see you. Um, Tonight I'm going to continue on with the process of working with Psychology and Alchemy, which is volume 12 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. But before I do that, I want to mention to those who didn't hear it earlier, yesterday I received my copy of this new book, Catafalque by Peter Kingsley. It's, in many ways, it's an homage to Carl Jung, but as you see, the subtitle of the book is Carl Jung and the End of Humanity. And you may recall that Dr. Jung, at the end of his life, kind of did some sort of end of humanity prediction with Marie-Louise von France. He did some sort of diagram, which she never revealed. She grabbed it out of his drawer immediately after his death, and she never showed it to anyone. But Peter Kingsley seems to think that Dr. Jung thought humanity had about 50 years left to go. And of course, that would have been over in 2011. So it's a good sign that we're still here. And a lot of the challenges that we had at the time of his death have been set aside. New ones have emerged and been dealt with, though. Yeah, the reason I gave that link is because this book does have some Greek words in it, and Dr. Jung doesn't always bother to translate them for us. And so the Latin ones I can read, but the Greek ones I can't, so I have to look them up, which is what was suggested by Edward Edinger. So it's not too difficult to learn Greek. It's a lot easier than learning Japanese kana script, which I was able to do in about 2 hours one time. And then I used it quite a lot. So it was very helpful. And I think as I'm looking at the Greek, it's sort of looking familiar already, so I think it'll be pretty good. But anyway, this book has 2 volumes. One volume, volume 2, is only footnotes, the footnotes of volume 1. And Peter Kingsley has a very gentle but persuasive way of writing. And so it's sort of it's sort of a pleasant change after having to work through all the footnotes and the prodigious scholarship of C.G. Jung. And here Peter Kingsley is talking about Jung, and he talks about some of his reservations about how Dr. Jung's memory has been kept among the Jungian analyst groups and the Jung societies around the United States, especially, but around the world. And basically, he's talking about the fact that various aspects of Jung's very colorful life were prettied up by those people, but gradually now we're starting to learn more and more. In 2020, I believe, they expect to publish the protocols that Agnella Jaffe prepared for Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Apparently, only about half of what Dr. Jung told her during her interviews with him in preparation for Memory Streams Reflections, only about half of what he told her was actually included in the book, and a lot of things were edited out. But apparently we're going to get much more. And if you haven't seen the movie A Dangerous Method, you might want to do that. There's also a terrific book about Emma Jung that's worth reading, and a terrific book about Dr. Jung and Tony Wolfe, who was his, well, a lot of us think, I think, that she was his lover, not only his shrink, but also his lover for about 50 years. But they lived in a kind of menage a trois quite openly. And so anyway, so this is not a cheap book, but it's well worth the read, and I'll be commenting more on it later. And I don't mean later tonight. I mean later in the next couple of weeks, because I did read chapter 7 into the channel tonight, and in the video entitled "What is Sacred," and I think it's worth listening to get a flavor for what Dr. Kingsley has written here. So anyway, to begin, to give our other members time to get here, I'm going to start with paragraph 12, and these are quite complex paragraphs, as you can see. And so what I'm going to do, just to do a preface for you, is I'm going to read paragraph 12 and then come back and go through it line by line with you, because Dr. Jung has crammed so much in these paragraphs, and keeping in mind that each paragraph in Dr. Jung's writing amounts to a psychic fact. Now we'll have to try to figure out what the heck the psychic fact is that's in this paragraph that I'm going to read. But it's a little more than a page. So I'm reading from Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung, published by Princeton University Press, volume 12 of the collected works. And so this is paragraph 12. Every archetype is capable of endless development and differentiation. It is therefore possible for it to be more developed or less. In an outward form of religion, where all the emphasis is on the outward figure, hence where we are dealing with a more or less complete projection, the archetype is identical with externalized ideas, but remains unconscious as a psychic factor. When an unconscious content is replaced by a projected image to that extent, it is cut off from all participation in and influence on the conscious mind. Hence, it largely forfeits its own life, because prevented from exerting the formative influence on consciousness natural to it. What is more, it remains in its original form, unchanged, for nothing changes in the unconscious. At a certain point, it even develops a tendency to regress to lower and more archaic levels. It may easily happen, therefore, that a Christian who believes in all the sacred figures is still undeveloped and unchanged in his inmost soul, because he has all God outside and does not experience him in his soul. His deciding motives, his ruling interests and impulses do not spring from the sphere of Christianity, but from the unconscious and undeveloped psyche, which is as pagan and archaic as ever. Not the individual alone, but the sum total of individual lives in a nation proves the truth of this contention. The great events of our world, as planned and executed by man, do not breathe the spirit of Christianity, but rather of unadorned paganism. These things originate in a psychic condition that has remained archaic and has not been even remotely touched by Christianity. The Church assumes, not altogether without reason, that the fact of having been once believed leaves certain traces behind it. But of these traces, nothing is to be seen in the broad march of events. Christian civilization has proved hollow to a terrifying degree. It is all veneer. But the inner man has remained untouched and therefore unchanged. His soul is out of key with his external beliefs. In his soul, the Christian has not kept pace with external developments. Yes, everything is to be found outside, in image and in word, in church and Bible, but never inside. Inside reign the archaic gods, supreme as of old. That is to say, the inner correspondence with the outer God image is undeveloped for lack of psychological culture, and has therefore got stuck in heathenism. Christian education has done all that is humanly possible, but it has not been enough. Too few people have experienced the divine image as the innermost possession of their own souls. Christ only meets them from without, never from within the soul. That is why dark paganism still reigns. That is why dark paganism still reigns there. A paganism which, now in a form so blatant that it can no longer be denied, and now in all too threadbare disguise, is swamping the world of so-called Christian civilization. Now, it's to be remembered that this particular book, and presumably this paragraph, was written during World War II. And the book was first published in German in 1944. And so Dr. Jung must have been writing on it during the workup through World War II, since World War II started in Europe on September 1st, 1939. And so he had also been through World War I, and of course knew of all the damage and trouble that had been caused by World War I, including the loss of about 8 million lives in the trenches. And so he had quite a pessimistic outlook at that point of time. Not that we should ignore it, not at all, because obviously we've morphed these things, but we still have big problems in our society and with the way our religions approach these issues. But so I want to go back and talk through this paragraph, and certainly I'll take any of your comments and questions as we go along. Grenade says, Christianity has a bad habit of putting the evil outside itself. Absolutely. Despite the concept of original sin. Right. Because Christianity wants privatio boni, which means that God is all good, and that evil is only the privation of good, which sort of suggests that Hitler and Stalin and Eichmann and those characters just didn't get enough mother's milk or something. So And of course, it's far worse than that, because they did play on the archetypes very heavily. And they even, used some of Dr. Jung's ideas and Freud's ideas to move the Third Reich along very consciously. So let's go back to this for a minute. So every archetype is capable of endless development and differentiation. So what Dr. Jung felt is that on the planet we have people at about 10,000 years worth of development actually living today. In other words, if you go to maybe the most primitive Bushmen in Central Africa, for example, they are much as they were maybe 100,000 years ago, but at least 10,000 years ago in that case. And then if you go to different countries, you can see different stages of development. So I have often observed that if you go to India, you see the 21st century overlaid over the 12th century. You see truly horrific things there that you might have seen in Europe in the 12th century. But then you also see the most modern things and the most modern buildings and so on. A similar state of affairs exists in Muslim countries, where they're willing to kill people who they call apostate. That means heretics. And in the West, I'm not exactly sure when the Inquisition stopped. About 200 years ago is when I believe it was finally abolished, but I don't think we've burned anybody at the stake for about 400 or 500 years. So let's see. Next, it is therefore possible for it to be more developed or less, as I've said, in an outward form of religion where all the emphasis is on the outward figure. Hence, where we are dealing with a more or less complete projection, the archetype is identical with the externalized ideas, but remains unconscious as a psychic factor. So this is one of the reasons why worshiping graven images was a bad thing, because if you worship an image, something that somebody made or carved, or Moses had it with the people at Mount Sinai when he was carving the Ten Commandments. He came back from the mountain with the Ten Commandments and found them carving some sort of graven image that he immediately had them destroy. And he must have instinctually known that that wasn't going to be a good thing, that you have to feel the sacred from within. And, so it also raises a question about the crucifix in Christianity, because it shows Christ hanging on the cross in the Catholic Church. And it's, I believe, one of the reasons why in Protestant churches there's no figure of Christ on the cross. And that forces you to look inward for some of your answers. So let's go on here. When an unconscious content is replaced by a projected image, to that extent, it is cut off from all participation in and influence on the conscious mind. So what he's talking about here is the God image, the self, and if people are extremely pious and their religion is outside of themselves, as was the case in the Middle Ages essentially, then there's no possibility for the archetype that's in the deep unconscious. It's the deepest archetype in the unconscious. There's no possibility for that to be constellated. And if it's not constellated, then people don't feel the power of God within them. And so this is one of the issues with a creed, because you can learn all the rules of your creed and do all the rituals, but if they don't get through to this God image, this deep self, which is the religious function that Dr. Jung identified, then they're just going to be meaningless, and anything that the preacher says is just going to wash off their backs. And so hence it largely forfeits its own life, because prevented from exerting the formative influence on consciousness natural to it. What is more, it remains in its original form, unchanged, for nothing changes in the unconscious. Well, maybe not nothing. There is evolution after all, but we're pretty much clear that human beings today are pretty much like the human beings that have been alive in all times that are recorded in modern history. And so you have to feel the archetype in order to experience God. This is Dr. Jung's position. And at a certain point, it even develops a tendency to regress to lower and more archaic levels. Okay, so we have seen over the last, let's say, 20 years in American politics, we had a certain level of civilization where rape, for example, was very rare. And now we've come to a time where it seems that a lot of young people have the idea that it's a rite of passage or something like that. And that's just not acceptable from my point of view. But we have to balance these things out. And I'll just remind you of my favorite Jung quote, which is, "Too much of the animal distorts civilized man. Too much civilization makes sick animals." And so I'm not saying that we need to accept a certain level of rape. I certainly don't agree with that. And I'm the father of 3 daughters, so I'm definitely against that. But we have to have some way of addressing this in society, and we have to recognize that we are, after all, animals with animal instincts, and so we have to have a way to regulate that. And as Dr. Jung was clearly pointing out here, we weren't regulating it very well when we had Christian nations blasting one another apart in the 20th century. And so there was a lot of instinct getting played out there. Let's see. And for my lights, I think that a lot of American men have regressed, gone backward in terms of where we were in terms of our development of our civilization in this country. And I think that may be true around the world. Okay, let me just take a look. Granat says Christianity has a bad habit of putting the evil outside itself, despite original sin. I guess we read that. Hi, Mallory. Glad to catch this. Is the crucifix a death symbol? Gee, I haven't really studied the crucifix. I was brought up in a Protestant church, so I can't really say that I have examined all the meanings of the symbolism of the crucifix. Certainly, the crucifix has a dead or dying man on the cross in the Catholic Church, and I think it's the Catholic symbol that is usually referred to as the crucifix. In Protestant churches, we simply refer to it as the cross, I think. So is it a death symbol? Yeah, surely it is in some way. It's a symbol of what's going on. I think Dr. Jung described the cross, leaving out Christ for a moment, but just described the cross as a mandala, which has spirit on the upper end of it and the chthonic or the earth-like aspect of it at the bottom. So it was that duality or set of opposites. And then there was the two thieves, one of whom went to heaven and one went to hell. One, repented for his sins, and Christ saw to it that he went to heaven. At least so goes the story, but the other didn't repent, and he went to hell. And so that's the opposite between good and evil. So it symbolizes that, certainly. But beyond that, in terms of death symbols, or, when you ask that question, it makes me think of occult symbolism. And because there are death symbols in occult symbolism, and there's a death card in the tarot, which is symbolic of death. In the tarot, it doesn't mean death; it means change. It doesn't mean physical death; it means the death of some process. But obviously that particular card doesn't have a cross on it at all. So anyway, let's carry on. It may easily happen, therefore, that a Christian who believes in all the sacred figures is still undeveloped and unchanged in his inmost soul, because he has all God outside and does not experience him in the soul. His deciding motives, his ruling interests and impulses do not spring from the sphere of Christianity, but from the unconscious and undeveloped psyche, which is as pagan and archaic as ever. So Dr. Jung is saying that our instincts are still quite old, and he frequently talked about what he called the 2 million-year-old man, but I would have to say it's the 3.5 billion-year-old man, because all of us are descended from single-celled organisms that successfully reproduced for the last 3.5 billion years. And so the undeveloped psyche developed during that process. And unless Christianity or any other religion can somehow change that and mold it into a civilized approach, then we have trouble, as we see when we go to war. If you well, let's see. Why did dear old dad not want to talk about the war? Well, dear old dad saw some pretty horrific things in the war, very likely, regardless of what war he went to, which is why there is such a thing as PTSD. And so that's looking at evil, something that's pretty evil, up close and personal. It's archetypal, and I think many men are not prepared for that in any way, and so they just, when they come back from war, they can't process it and they can't share it with their family, and so they simply carry it. Just in my father-in-law's case, for example, he never could talk about his time in World War II when he served as a gunner on a civilian ship for 2 years. So he was in all these convoys that went around the Atlantic, and so his work was quite dangerous, and he was in at least one amphibious landing at Anzio that I know of, and he never spoke about it to his wife or his children. My wife, his daughter, and it was only when I came along with military experience that he could open up and he could talk about it to me. And his experience was quite mild compared to, let's say, the experience of infantryman that's been in an infantry-style firefight or battle of any sort. Not that it wouldn't have been terrible if his ship had sunk, but fortunately his ship was never torpedoed, so he never saw those really bad scenes. But that's why you can't bring them out. So Mallory says, okay, thanks. I grew up Catholic and was always told to meditate on the crucifix, I guess to feel guilty about Jesus' sacrifice, but I suspect there's a more primitive unconscious effect. Sorry, not trying to derail your topic. Well, this is on topic, Mallory. I can't say what Catholic priests are thinking when they tell you to do that. What I know from what I've read from Dr. Jung is that if you follow that advice, you're not going to probably have a religious experience. And I don't know if you've followed some of the discussions about religious experience that we've had on this channel, but if you've had one, then okay, and then you're connected with the God image in your psyche at the very least. And Dr. Jung's point, which I think he makes either in this paragraph or the next as well, is that understanding it from a psychological point of view in no way detracts from it, and detracts from the religious experience. But what he does say is that if you put all these rituals and the Bible and the teachings of the church in the way without understanding them, without appreciating their real meaning and significance, then chances are you aren't going to have a true religious experience. And this is where Jordan Peterson's work on the Bible is extremely valuable, because he's gone in depth into the psychological meaning of the Bible. And so unlike fundamentalist preachers who want you to believe everything that you read in the in the Bible as a physical fact. Dr. Jung, on the other hand, in answer to Job, paragraph 752, said that every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche. It's not a statement of the physical world, and it shouldn't be believed in that way or understood in that way. Let's not say believed, because believe gets to be a problem. But if you have a true religious experience, regardless of your religion, you will know, and then you can use your own tradition, whatever it is, whatever rituals it may have, to enhance that. So that's what Dr. Jung was driving at, I think. Hi, Gray. Welcome. Don't feel guilty about what Christ did. Just repeat the deed yourself, psychologically speaking, of course. Okay, well, that's one thing that was never clear to me. I mean, it's only been in the last 2 or 3 years, and maybe since I began doing this website, that I've understood what it is that's being asked for, because Dr. Jung points out in Ion and some of his other books that the church wants from you imitatio Christi, imitation of Christ. But what the heck does that mean? And they never explain it. And Dr. Jung explains it. He says that yourself, which is your God image, is the thing that's driving you individually to develop in the way you were intended to develop. Now, in Christ's case, he saw himself and understood himself as the Son of God. And so he lived that life completely, okay, with the one exception that made him the God-man, which was that he asked on the cross why God had forsaken him. But aside from that, he lived his self, his personal story. And this is the message that Dr. Jung is trying to give through psychology, which is we all have to live our own story. And so the whole idea of individuation is to allow the flower that's you to open and happen in the same sense that in the same sense that my body creates my right eye or my left eye or my nose. Those things are done unconsciously, and they come from the deep unconscious. And so the things that are pushing you to do things in life, that comes from the deep unconscious as well. I mean, you don't know what you're going to do in the next 2 minutes. I don't know what I'm going to do in the next 2 minutes. The Spirit will drive me and guide me to what I do in the next 2 minutes. But that comes from a very, very deep level in the unconscious. I don't control it from my ego mind. And this is what I think Dr. Jung was driving at. I hope I'm clear about that. But if you have questions about it, please do, or comments about what I've said, please let me know. Sean says, I think it stands as understanding pain, forgiveness, and reflection. That is an important archetype, and why even Christ was able to forgive Judas. Yes, Sean, but I agree with you that is the upshot. But were you taught that? I mean, do you understand that from your religious teaching, or do you understand that because you've been studying Carl Jung? I'd really like to know that. Okay, it says he forgave the incapacity of man because he saw the same incapacity in himself. Okay, but the stories we have about the Bible I don't think are that highfalutin in terms of this psychological stuff. Yes, Christ did do the things in the Bible. I don't deny that. But to suggest that he consciously had some psychological ulterior motive, I doubt that very much. I think he was presenting himself as what he saw himself to be, which was the Son of God. And I don't think he thought much more about it than that, or that's not my impression. But if you've been taught otherwise, then I'd love to know how you were, other than anything that we've said in Jungian studies. Buzz says, hello, sir. Hello, Buzz. I think Dostoevsky and his Tartar is a meditation that may interest Mallory Reed. I understand that there's a very good monologue in Dostoevsky, and maybe more than one. I'm not completely familiar with it, although Jordan Peterson has had a couple of monologues about Dostoevsky, so that's available on YouTube. Grace says, Christ did what was required. He must do this. We must do the same. Yes. Okay. So Christ did what was required of him, what God the Father was telling him to do as the Son of God. But it doesn't mean that you're going to do what Christ did. Okay, nobody's asking you to go out and preach that you're the son or daughter of God, although you can see yourself that way. And this is how Jung ultimately and Edward Edinger came around to saying that that's really what we are, but you have to understand that. I mean, let me give you an example. I have a very good friend who's a rabbi. I won't go into his pedigree, but he's a very influential rabbi and a very progressive rabbi. And he's constantly, about every quarter, he comes up with this thing about how the Jews are the chosen people. And every time he does that, I say, come on, man, we're all chosen. All of us are chosen. And so the idea that the tribe of Jews is the only tribe that God blesses is, just, it's very first century-ish, I would say, or maybe 1,000 years before Christ, even, when various writers at that time in the Old Testament said that the Jews were chosen people. But at the time of Job, 500 years before Christ, there were already 100 million people on the planet. 100 million. And so to say that God has only blessed the Jews is, I understand that the idea was a bonding agent for the Jewish diaspora around the world over many millennia and many troubled times. I do understand that idea helped them in that way. But please do not think that you are not chosen. We are all chosen. And so the point that Jung and Edinger ultimately made is that we all have a trace of divinity within us, and we have to recognize that trace of divinity. And how do you do it? Well, you have a religious experience. Once you have a religious experience, there's no doubt. And so, So I'm not quite sure about your point, Grenade, so I'm going to pass that up. Sean says, that's a reflection that I came to. If I was put into his shoes and the sum of everything he felt, I mean to look at what I said more as an image rather than words. I actually didn't know how I felt till I went back and put words to the images in my head. That's a fair enough point. And to realize that what we went through is not only archetype, but has been written about for thousands upon thousands of years, humbling really, right. And Sean says, I also didn't mean it as something definitive, but rather just how I saw it. And Gray says, there's nothing definitive, only different levels of understanding and different perspectives, okay? Because just given the MBTI personality test, we can delineate 16 different personality types, and we all look at these issues, every single one of them, from a different point on that on those scales. And so, the discussion of the matrix is appropriate because we really are in a matrix where everyone is somewhat different. Each of you is, and I am. And, but, there's still something common that's within all of us. And, physiologically, human beings are essentially the same, regardless of what tribe we came out of. So then Dr. Jung goes on in this paragraph to say, when he talked about the psyche being as pagan and archaic as ever, he says, not the individual alone, but the sum total of individual lives in a nation proves the truth of this contention. The great events of our world, as planned and executed by man, do not breathe the spirit of Christianity, but rather of unadorned paganism. And so again, he was writing in the middle of World War II, and I think he was very aware of the pagan archetypes that Adolf Hitler and his henchmen were playing with at the time. And obviously they were not Christian, and at least not in the proper sense. And we can argue about who's a Christian in the United States today. There was this article this morning about the proclivities of at least 400 faith leaders from the Southern Baptist Church. And, these are the same people that told my daughter that I was going to hell. And so I'll see them all there. That's my appointment. When I'm in hell, they can, I'll be waiting for them. And Grenade says, not only that, but people can fluctuate their MBTI personality with age and experience, and also by situation and terrain. For example, when I was in the reserve of the Marine Corps and living a civilian life, for example, but every time I put my uniform on, I would be ISTJ and not INTP, which is my normal way of being. So we do change those things as we go along. Grace says, And I tell my biology students that daily. Also, variation leads to adaptation. Absolutely. Buzz says, I tend to like the prisoner quote about not being categorized. We have the potential to be unique. I tend to avoid personality tests. Well, or in the words of Groucho Marx, I would not belong to any club that would have me as a member. Okay, fair enough. But the MBTI is very useful if you're having regular dealings with people, because if you can get a working knowledge of it, and you can get that fairly easily by going to Barnes and Noble. There are always books about the Myers-Briggs available, or you can get them on Amazon. There are many of them. One is called People Types and Tiger Stripes, but that is an old book now, so maybe they're more modern ones. But if you have a working knowledge of it, it can be very helpful in dealing with people, no matter who you have to deal with. Because if you understand yourself in the context of the MBTI, then you can be more, forgiving if someone isn't quite that personality type. And by the same token, if you're in business, for example, or in a school, it can be very, very good to understand who you're talking to. And in business, you may not want a certain type of person in your group. Now, in the U.S. military, they want all types, and they really emphasize that at the senior levels. As I've said a few times, I've attended 4 of the senior schools of the U.S. military, and at every one of them, in my reserve 2 weeks when we would have a summer training, when it was the school, we would spend 1 day out of the 10 that were available to them. They would spend 1 day teaching us the MBTI. They thought it was that important that even reserve officers needed to know it. So I urge you, if you don't know it, to learn about it. And you can also learn about the personality type. There are several other tests. Jordan Peterson does talk about one, which I'm less enamored with than MBTI, but he likes it. And I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I'm not going to opine beyond that. Grace says, INTJ, the judging part is a lot to deal with for me. And Mallory says, INTP, I knew it. Yep, and I am INTP. And, that works pretty well for me and my wife. She's an INTJ also. And, we make a joke about it. We say, oh, that's very J of you, or that's very P of you. And so, she makes the shopping list when we go to the grocery store, and I buy the ice cream. And it works pretty well. That's the way a marriage is supposed to work. And Grenade says, those tests are never the end-all be-all, but they can be a useful tool. That's my point. I agree with that. Have you read the book of the 5 rings and the analogy to the carpenter? No, I haven't, Buzz. Grenade says, I try not to confuse the map with the territory. That's very wise. Metatron says, Jordan Peterson quote Jung as saying that an individual's highest value is that individual's God. Is this the self manifesting in the restricted domain of the present? Yeah, I would say that that's what he has in mind. An individuated person would be a person who is manifesting his self, which is also called the God image, and which is also called the greater personality. Yes, I agree, Greg. Okay, let me see if I can go on with this paragraph now. Okay. So he was kvetching about the fact that the great events of the world don't breathe Christianity. They don't breathe any other religion either. These things originate in a psychic condition that has remained archaic and has not been even remotely touched by Christianity. And so one of the big things that Dr. Jung would talk about is the fact that if you have 100 brilliant minds in a room, you've got one blockhead. And the reason for that is that if one person says something and another person holds back, then you've got that one person's idea going forward, and maybe it's not the best idea. And the more people that pile on, the less likely people are to raise their hand and say, no, that's wrong. And so pretty soon you have this mob going in one direction. And, we've been seeing that in our politics in the United States very dramatically. And we're going to see the consequences of it too. And so when we form into a group, we become less intelligent, believe it or not, regardless of what group it is. So anyway, the church assumes, not altogether without reason, that the fact of having once believed leaves certain traces behind it. Okay, so there's some fair reason to say that if you went to Sunday school and, you learned your morality in that way, that it's going to leave traces behind even if you're not a faithful Christian. And, but, when I was in Vietnam, on Mondays, every day the regimental commander would have a command briefing, and every different section of the regiment would have a chance to get up and give him their report. And every Monday the chaplain would get up and he would say, well, we had 11 Marines in chapel yesterday. Or something like that, some number under 20, certainly. In fact, I don't remember any number above 15. And so this is in a Marine Corps regiment that has 5,000 men in it, plus attachments. And so, but those men came back from battle, and they're living largely moral lives today. And it doesn't mean that they aren't necessarily good Christians, but the old saw about there's no atheists in foxholes, that's not really there. People make their own judgments. Let's see. Okay. I'm not sure what you mean, Buzz, what I would find interesting. I might have missed a citation there. Sean says, do you think the opposite of logic is obviously rather than illogical? Note, not all logic is good. I think we ought to think about this more as rational and irrational, but irrational doesn't also mean bad. I mean, some things are decided in an irrational way, but it's your unconscious being rational in some way. I mean, in other words, that 2 million-year-old man, when he selects the woman of your choice, the woman of your dreams, your anima, to be your wife, that isn't necessarily a very rational thing, but nonetheless, your unconscious has worked it out and knows what your unconscious wants in a partner. And Mallory says it's a great tool. I was fortunate to be taught it by an old Jungian when I was 23. Yep. It's like a pendulum. The politics will swing back toward a balance. Yes, I do believe that. I agree with that. And this is a fundamental Jungian concept, which is a word that you need to understand and look up. It's called it's enantiodromia, and it's a Greek word which means the tendency of things to become their opposite. And so, in my lifetime, the positions of the political parties have exactly swapped. Okay, because the party of the American South used to be the Democratic Party, and so George Wallace and some of those people that were fighting civil rights in the 60s were Democrats. But then subsequently, both parties just changed sides, basically. And so that's enantiodromia in action. Okay, I'm not quite following your point, Buzz. So Sean was relating back to Eros and Logos, and I think that we might want to talk about the opposite of Logos being life, as opposed to Eros, because I seem to get in trouble when I use the term Eros because people think I'm talking about erotica, and I'm not. I'm talking about the fact that once you know all the rules, then you have to get a life and live that life around that framework. And that's the opposite, really. That's what Eros sort of means, but I think that's what we need to be talking about. And Sean says, love being a strong emotion. And as I said in my earlier video today, they're repeating Don Juan DeMarcos or Johnny Depp from John Juan DeMarcos, which I put the link on the previous video, but there are only 4 questions that are worth considering in life. What is sacred? What is the spirit made? What is worth living for and what is worth dying for? And in every case, the answer is love. And I think that that's a very profound idea, and high marks to the filmmaker who came up with that line, or the screenplay writer. And Granat says, logically, could you say it's the interaction of oxytocin and serotonin that bonds social creatures together? I have no idea, honestly. But I think that that's sort of a reductionist way of looking at life. And if you look at life in that reductionist way, then you're not going to have much fun. And so I prefer not to know what chemicals are at work when I'm loving my wife, for example. It's like there's too much information. So we live on many levels, and we have to be discerning about what level we should be living on. And so, Granada, in fairness, okay, at some level that's probably a valid question, but I think we're talking about a level of life that's more touchy-feely than that. And just a moment. Oh, you're lucky I got to my mic in time. Anyway, um, you know, people in the U.S., people that want to sell you a rational world, everything is a rational world, make touchy-feely seem like it's a bad thing, okay? But that's not right, okay? Touchy-feely is what life is about. And if you have to live everything by the book rationally, then you might as well go out and shoot yourself because you're not living. I'm being facetious here. I'm not suggesting anybody should commit suicide, but the point is that we can't live that way. The old saying, you can't live by bread alone. Okay, so bread is a logical thing that you need to keep your body functioning, or some sort of food that provides you with energy so your body keeps functioning. But we have to have many other things in our life in order to make it all work, and they're not all rational. So Art says, I think it's a God of your own undo. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Art. I presume you're talking about the Don Juan DeMarco quote, Mallory, which is one of my favorites of my whole life. Sean says, I related Eros to Cupid, to love instead of erotica. Well, I mean, it's all of the above. Erotica's in there, so is pornography and everything else. But because we're talking about two really major slices in the way to look at the world, in a world where there are thousands of opposites, and we're talking about one major one where everything goes in one side or the other. It's like red state, blue state stuff. We have to think of these things in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So what happens if you mix red state and blue state together? You get purple. But what happens then? Well, okay, so at the next stage of human development, that purple then ends up being a new thesis, and it develops a new antithesis, and then there has to be another new synthesis, and that's the process that we're talking about here. And so if we look at how did the enantiodromia happen between the American political parties? Well, because the Democratic Party was all on one side at one point, and so Democrats started to put things into the political mix that had been Republican things, but they hold people over, and gradually they put more and more things in, and the Republicans were doing the same thing the other way, trying to steal one another's followings, and they crossed. And, it's something like what happens when the Andromeda galaxy collides with the Milky Way. Well, as a matter of fact, as astronomers tell us, it's very likely that no star will collide with any other star. They'll just go by one another because there's so much space in between. And so we're all very complicated creatures, and we have to look and pay attention to Anne Ulanoff's point of first things first. Okay, first thing is your family. Okay, and if you have any sense at all, you'll pay attention to your family as the first thing, no matter what. And then you can deal with other things in an order of importance, but it's the devil's trick to try to deal with item number 20 on the list if you're destroying your family in the process. That's not a good way to live and to have a happy life. Buzz says, to me, the body and mind continue living through boredom. It's the ability to endure. Well, thank goodness we all have that, at least for 100 years or so. And Art says that God comes to us on a one-by-one basis. Yes, that's true. And everybody has a different idea of what God is. Buzz says traffic wardens are quite happy to live that way. Yeah, maybe, but if people aren't paying them, or it's if they're having if there's a blizzard outside, they might not be too happy that day. So there are other considerations. Mallory, accountants and lawyers probably should consider suicide. Well, quite right in some way. I mean, and we'll call it metaphorical suicide, because I really loved going to law school. It was an interesting challenge, and I had fun doing it. But as soon as I started to practice law, I realized, oh my God, I'm dealing with other people's hardships constantly. And it was really crushing me. And I think the same thing probably has happened to someone like Jordan Peterson, who practiced psychotherapy for many years. You're always dealing with someone else's hardship, and it really can crush your spirit. And so I blew out of the practice of law. I did it for 5 years, but then I went into business and never looked back. I never really wanted to go back. I mean, I've been drawn back into it unintentionally, but nonetheless, I haven't practiced law for anyone but myself since 1979, and that's a different story we'll discuss on a different night. Grenade says, hey, don't say that my brother wants to be an accountant. Some people just feel at home being logical like that. Yes, they do. And, but what those folks need to understand is that you have a dominant side and a, let's say, an inferior typology side. And you need both in your life in order to have a satisfying life. And so it's very important to cultivate that other side. And so, although I'm not anything like the picture book Marine or the stereotypical Marine, nonetheless, I'm quite proud of my service and the fact that I'm now retired from the Marine Corps. And so that has been certainly a very fulfilling part of my life, even though it was not my primary modus operandi. Of course, I didn't understand that until I was almost finished with my Marine Corps career. I thought I was just following the training, but anyway, whatever. And anyway, I did enjoy it very much at various times. I didn't enjoy it that much in Vietnam, but other than that, it says, in my youth, I took to the law and argued each case with my wife, and the muscular strength it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life. Yeah, okay. You have to learn to live with both sides. I mean, that's what a marriage is and a partnership. Okay, so anyway, going on. And so anyway, Jung says, Christian civilization has proved hollow to a terrifying degree. It is all veneer, but the inner man has remained untouched and therefore unchanged. His soul is out of key with his external beliefs. Okay, and we definitely see that very heavily in the United States, and Dr. Jung observed it 100 years ago, that Americans tend to be very extroverted, and by extroverted he meant, we all are comparing our cars to our neighbor's cars type thing, or who's got a better boat, or who's got a more attractive wife. And so if we look at our president, okay, he's got a stereotypically beautiful wife. He's got one of the most prestigious buildings in New York City. He's the president of the United States. Is he happy? You think he's happy? That's a good question. It's worth thinking about. Let's see. Grenade says, arguing with women is an uphill battle. Or your significant other. Yes. So, as I've frequently said, I have a mug here, not here tonight, but if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, or the woods, no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the answer to the question is yes. And the reason for that answer is that we only bring one side of the picture. Everything is opposites, and we all have a dominant side and an inferior, not an inferior would be the wrong word, but a less strong side in terms of where we fit on the Myers-Briggs, let's say. And so everything is a duality, and you need somebody to bring the things into your life that you don't bring in. And for example, my wife and I are both introverts, but fortunately for me, my wife is a bit more gregarious than I am, and so I get to go to parties because she gets it organized. If it was just me doing it, I'd be sitting here doing videos and be perfectly happy to be introverted and talking to a camera. But fortunately for me, my wife says, no, we're going out with so-and-so tomorrow night. I say, okay. So that's the way the partnership has to work. And so it's not hard and fast. It's not just introvert or extrovert. It can be Skip's on the 77th percentile on introversion, and Debbie is on the 25th percentile of introversion, closer to the extroversion. And so she brings the extroversion to the extent that we as a couple have extroversion. It comes that way. That's an example. I could always win a logical argument with my mom, but she could tell I was feeling upset before I even was aware that I was upset. Yeah, she no doubt had that intuition. So going on about Christianity now, Dr. Jung, mind you, this is a man who's the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor, and he had 7 uncles who were Swiss Reformed pastors. Yes, everything is to be found outside, in image and in word, in church and Bible, but never inside. Inside reign the archaic gods, supreme as of old. That is to say, the inner correspondence with the outer God image is undeveloped for lack of psychological culture, and has therefore got stuck in heathenism. And so probably all of us can see ourselves, if we reflect on ourselves, we probably can see something heathenish within ourselves, and I won't beg that issue further. But regardless of men or women or whatever, we're still that caveman inside, or cavewoman. So Christian education has done all that is humanly possible, but it has not been enough. Too few people have experienced the divine image as the innermost possession of their own souls. Christ only meets them from without, never from within the soul. That is why dark paganism still reigns there, a paganism which now in a form so blatant that it can no longer be denied, and now in all too threadbare disguise is swamping the world of so-called Christian civilization. And so this is, again, basically a comment on World War II as I take it. I hope that's helpful. We've gotten through one paragraph here tonight, but these are important points, I think. Okay, going on. I'm going to go on to paragraph 13, which is about ethics. With the methods employed hitherto, we have not succeeded in Christianizing the soul to the point where even the most elementary demands of Christian ethics can exert any decisive influence on the main concerns of the Christian European. The Christian missionary may preach the gospel to the poor naked heathen, but the spiritual heathen who populate Europe have as yet heard nothing of Christianity. So I'll come back to that. At least I'm turning off the mic. So his point is that, we can go through the motions, but if you haven't had an actual religious experience, chances are it hasn't grabbed you what is meant by that and what is meant by God, okay, to include what is meant by Dr. Edinger's statement that in 1500 God fell out of heaven and into the human psyche. That's a pretty profound statement, but the reality is that people of antiquity did understand that they were talking about things that were happening in their psyche. And Dr. Jung has gone into that in very great detail in some of his books. And so the question is, how do we develop? And the problem is that as long as we have an atheistic or a materialistic point of view, we can't really develop. And so what happens, let's see, this is my favorite picture, but I'll show it to you again. Okay, so here's a materialistic image. Okay, this person has a 63-foot motor yacht, and the marina that's in my community is just filled with fiberglass like this. But has this person found happiness any more than the President of the United States has found happiness by all his things? It's like King Midas and the idea that you touch something and it turns to gold. Oh yeah, that's great, but in the end he touched his daughter, and his daughter turns to gold in the parable. And so that's the sort of idea that we have to think about, which is, how do we get through to understand what it's about? I mean, Albert Finney died this week, and Albert Finney was in a famous movie about 50 years ago called Alfie. And in Alfie, there's this tune, "What's it all about, Alfie?" And the question is, what is it about? And if it's about the winner is the guy who dies with the most toys, no, that isn't the way it works. And I think our president has definitely found that, because although he would argue very rationally that he's the winner because he has the big boat and the beautiful wife and so on, he might make that argument, but has he found happiness? No. I don't think he has at all. And so we have to look for happiness in a different place. So I could always, let's see, Buzz says, the trouble with guilt as a motivator is that it may cause inaction. At some point we have to stop apologizing and get on with living, or it traps us. Yes, I agree with that. Sean says, Skip's best quote for that is, if you're not making a mistake every day, you're trying hard enough. Yeah, that's what I do say. Okay, so finally in this paragraph then, Christianity must indeed begin again from the very beginning if it is to meet its high educative task. So long as religion is only faith and outward form, and the religious function is not experienced in our own souls, nothing of any importance has happened. It has yet to be understood that the mysterium magnum, the great mystery, is not only an actuality, but is first and foremost rooted in the human psyche. The man who does not know this from his own experience may be a most learned theologian, but he has no idea of religion and still less of education. And so Dr. Jung was fighting with theologians his whole career, but his point is that if you're a theologian and you haven't had a religious experience, so that if you're asked, do you believe in God, the answer that you need to be giving is, I have no need to believe because I know. And if you don't know, then there's nothing that can be done to help you. And as he said, you may be a learned theologian, but you don't know anything about religion, and still less about education and what it means. And yet he looks at other women and makes coarse comments. I don't know who you're talking about, me or Dr. Jung. Mallory says, sweet quote, Buzz, I want to go out for a drink with him. No, he'd be boring. Are you talking about me or Dr. Jung or someone else, Buzz? I'm just curious who you'd like to go out for a drink with. And you know, as a concept, Dr. Jung is a really special man, but in being actually with him might be overwhelming in many ways. Oh, you mean the president? Yeah. Well, I mean, we know what the topic would be if you went out for a drink with him, because it's always about him, right? Mallory says, that's my favorite Jung quote because I've had 2 religious experiences. Absolutely. And by the way, I am interested in doing more interviews, one-on-one interviews over Zoom with any of you who want to share with our group your own experiences with Dr. Jung's work. And I've done a couple already, as you may have seen. One was Uber Boyo, and one was with Ed. I'm not going to use full names here for confidentiality purposes, but I think that those have gone well. I've also had an agreement from a former government minister from Canada who has said he will do an interview with me in March, and I am very grateful to Miles Flagg for making that possible. And but I would certainly like to hear about religious experiences and have people discuss those. Dr. Edinger was asked, how do you have this experience? And he said, reflect on what you love and hate. And, you know, what I would say is, you know, with something, anything that's a conflict with you, if you think of yourself on one side, the thesis or the antithesis on the other side, then just reflect on what the synthesis is. Try to think of yourself as above the fray for a bit, and that may provide it. Now, in my case, most of the time when I have a really head-stomping religious experience, there's some emotion behind it, and you can see a playlist on this channel called Breakthroughs to the Unconscious, and there I've put descriptions of a number of my religious experiences, but there are many. And William James, who was a famous psychologist of the late 19th century, who influenced Dr. Jung very much in his early days, wrote a book called Varieties of Religious Experience. I have not read that yet, but I do have it on Audible, so I'm planning to read it quite soon. I am still trying to finish Consilience by biologist Professor Edwin O. Wilson, but sometime soon. And so, peace, Buzz. Talk to you soon. Well, Granada, I'll be happy to tease it out of you. Let's put it that way. Um, and so you can write to me an email, and we'll see if we can arrange that. And I do this on Zoom, and so the interview process itself is not public, although I do make a video, and what I'd like to do is be able to use the interview on the channel. But I do it privately because you might say something you don't really want to have repeated out into the world, and so I do have the option of editing later on. So anyway, that was paragraph 13, and okay, let me read paragraph 14 since we have a few more minutes, and then we can see what we have to say about it. So this is paragraph 14 of Psychology and Alchemy. Yet when I point out that the soul possesses by nature a religious function, okay, this is Dr. Jung's main point here, and when I stipulate that it is the prime task of all education of adults to convey the archetype of the God image, or its emanations and effects, to the conscious mind, then it is precisely the theologian who seizes me by the arm and accuses me of psychologism. But were it not a fact of experience, the supreme values reside in the soul, quite apart from Antionomen Pneuma. Okay, so I had to translate that from Greek, and you can find a Greek alphabet on the internet, and I think I actually put a link to it at the top of this chat thing. And so when Dr. Jung puts these random Greek things in without translating, you can easily figure it out. So it's Antionomen Pneuma. So psychology would not interest me in the least, for the soul would then be nothing but a miserable vapor. I know, however, from hundredfold experiences, that it is nothing of the sort, but on the contrary, contains the equivalence of everything that has been formulated in dogma and a good deal more, which is just what enables it to be an eye destined to behold the light. So what he's saying is that, what is said in religious dogma is true and is in the psyche. And in fact, he said that every religious statement is basically true of all religions. But we have to have people understand what we're talking about. And so if you think you're talking about a magic puppeteer up there in the sky that's going to make you make your touchdown or get the pay raise that you want or something like that, that's not how it works. And so this requires limitless range and unfathomable depth of vision. I have been accused of deifying the soul. Here's his important point. Not I, but God himself has deified it. I did not attribute a religious function to the soul. I merely produced the facts which prove that the soul is naturaliter religiosa, i.e., possesses a religious function. I did not invent or insinuate this function. It produces itself of its own accord without being prompted thereto by any opinions or suggestions of mine. With a truly tragic delusion, these theologians fail to see that it is not a matter of proving the existence of the light, but of blind people who do not know that their eyes could see. It is high time we realize that it is pointless to praise the light and preach it if nobody can see it. It is much more needful to teach people the art of seeing, for it is obvious that far too many people are incapable of establishing a connection between the sacred figures and their own psyche. They cannot see to what extent the equivalent images are lying dormant in their own unconscious. In order to facilitate this inner vision, we must first clear the way for the faculty of seeing. How this is to be done without psychology, that is, without making contact with the psyche, is frankly beyond my comprehension. Okay, so he's relating this to the criticisms he's had from theologians, but the point is that it's a question of understanding what the Bible is about, or the Quran, or any other sacred text, the Bhagavad Gita. And if you understand it from a psychological point of view, then it can be a living document for you. Then you can find a living God within yourself, and you can understand how God makes things happen, his modus operandi. And so this was his point here. And, so I don't proselytize any religion anymore, because I never did, but I surely don't now, because I believe that the point is that we need to teach people how to see. And, that is one of the beauties of Jordan Peterson's 13 or so lectures that he did on the Old Testament, because they really help you see what the founding fathers of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity were saying, and what they were driving at, and what they were talking about, and what it all meant. And so, what those 13 or so lectures are the best I've seen. I certainly have not gotten it from the pulpit anywhere, I regret to say. And so let's see. Mallory, you're welcome to email me as well. I'll put my email link, ID, or email on here. That's my email address. I don't hide it, but I do hope that people use it respectfully. And Sean says it's a transference of some sort. Yeah, I suppose it is a transference of some sort. We need to go back and think about that. To me, this quote is important. To me, the quote, the more brilliant the lightning, the quicker it disappears. Okay, that's fair enough. That's a good quote. I like that one. I changed the quote for myself to be bright but brief. Right. I think that to the extent, Sean, that we have seen many artists of various kinds, whether they be authors, painters, or musicians, or singers, whatever, who burn a very bright light, often they don't know how to handle it, and often they crash and burn in some way. I mean, we can think in terms of Arthur Miller or Jackson Pollock or many others. Obviously, Michael Jackson would be an example, and so they need this grounding probably more than anybody else, um, because you need to be grounded, and if you're not, you're just going to go off into space. Now, I'm not saying you can't have a happy life that way. Maybe you can. I'm not going to make any judgments on any specific person's life, other than to observe that I don't think our president is very happy. But aside from that, I think that all of us could do well to be able to ground our loved ones who tend to go off on some sort of inflation. It was said about Orson Welles, who won the Academy Award for Citizen Kane when he was 25 years old, that there's nothing sadder than a genius realized too early. And that was the high point of his career, and then he was still around for another 50 years or more, but that was he never quite reached that pinnacle again. And so we need to find ways to properly ground ourselves so that we can use both the exciting successes, which can be inflationary, and have that connected back to the earth. In fact, there's been an interesting article on this in Atlantic this week about how famous people sometimes become rather arrogant and upsetting, and this came up in the context of comments about Amy Klobuchar and a couple of other candidates for president in the U.S. And in this article, it was commenting that Clementine, who was Winston Churchill's wife, used to send him notes saying, "I hear you're not being very nice lately, and so you better straighten up," or something like that. So here's a spouse, a life partner, who is doing the necessary grounding when their partner gets a little bit inflated and isn't properly connecting with the world. And obviously Winston Churchill had every right to become inflated in some ways because he saved Britain in many ways, but at least his wife was performing this grounding function for him. And so you might want to look for that article. It's in this week's Atlantic, although I don't have the link for it right now. And Sean says, "I don't mind suffering if I can pull someone out of hell." That's very good. It says that makes me mad, but a good kind of mad. And there have been a number of people that have come to me and said that my videos have made a difference in their lives, and I very much appreciate them letting me know. And I keep those interactions confidential, but if I can make a difference in people's lives. In fact, that was the original motivation of doing this channel at all, or doing the reading group at all, which was simply that I had found Dr. Jung's work very helpful to me personally. And I've been through a few trials and tribulations, as you may come to learn, but by reading Dr. Jung's work, it has kept me grounded. And I know that one of my acquaintances who was also a successful businessman and also obviously had problems at the time of the crash of 2008. He went out in the middle of the lake and shot himself, leaving his wife to clean up the mess, not only the physical mess, but also the mess with his business. So we do have to stay grounded somehow. And Andy, I would say we all have to have that understanding, because all life is suffering. Everything about it is suffering. We're problem-solving creatures, but a day doesn't go by that you don't suffer in some way, and so we need to build an ego that's strong enough to face those slings and arrows of life, and that's what the Job archetype is about. And Sean says, what do you think heals women? I know a woman heals a man, but I think it's children that heals women. Well, Dr. Jung felt that men sought perfection and women sought wholeness. And so if women feel that they've achieved wholeness in their life, I think that heals them. And they also then can heal the men in their lives, because the men tend to seek perfection, and none of us are perfect. And so we often have crises because of our imperfections. And if we don't have a woman in our life who is going to, or a partner, it doesn't mean it has to be a heterosexual marriage. It can be a life partner, but someone who's fulfilling that wholeness need, then, there are suicides and things, and that's a shame. And so, what my understanding, to the extent I can opine on this, is that women seek wholeness. And I think I nailed it in my novel, which you can find in the Dropbox. My wife refused to read my novel until I'd had 10 other women read it. What she didn't understand was that I worked in an industry that was all women, so I had more than 100 women read it, and they all loved it. And so somehow I think I nailed it in that novel. But I was following the template of Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who was describing the development of, sort of an individuation cycle in women. And I followed her template, and it seems to have worked out based on the feedback I have from women. Now, whether the ones that don't like it just don't say anything, that could be. I don't know, and I don't try to sell the novel, but if you get interested in looking in that, you might see something there. Sean says, I asked my mom and sisters this, and they answered children, but my sister laughed and said animals as well. Animals certainly are attractive to women. You can just see that on Facebook at any given time. There's, my wife is constantly showing me cutesy images of women or of animals on Facebook, and my mother-in-law too. And when we started to have these distant cameras that could watch osprey or eagles having their babies, we for several years, 4 or 5 years, we were watching that constantly every day. and it was extremely fulfilling to my wife and my mother-in-law. And nowadays you can watch watering holes in Africa that are very interesting, where elephants and lions and tigers come to water, and also hippopotamus and all kinds of creatures come. So it's not only birds, but I would highly recommend that that's true. So anyway, okay, we're running out of time here, so I'm going to sign off. My wife wants to get to bed early because she has a big day tomorrow. So I'm going to excuse myself, and I'll probably find something to read tomorrow. You never know. But in any case, thank you for being here tonight, and I will continue with paragraph 15 next week. This is a slow march through psychology and alchemy, but I think it's a very useful way to talk about many of the issues that were important to Dr. Jung. And so I think it's worthwhile, but if you have any thoughts about it, whether good, pro or con, please do drop me a line and let me know what you think. I'm happy to think of another strategy if this Monday night strategy is not serving your needs. So anyway, thanks for being here today, and I'll talk to you soon.